Tygo Gernandt finally spoke. He did not begin with anger, nor with accusations. He began with a sentence that felt heavier than any confession about love or betrayal. The children he had been raising, the children whose school bags he packed, and whose nightmares he calmed in the middle of the night, were not biologically his. That realization, according to his own account, did not arrive as a single shock, but as a slow, corrosive doubt. One that crept into quiet evenings and ordinary mornings, dismantling the life he thought he had built. In that instant, fatherhood, devotion, and identity collapsed into a single unbearable question. Who had he really been all this time? For more than a year, Tygo had lived inside a marriage that, from the outside, appeared brief yet promising. A union marked by intensity rather than longevity. He described how the first cracks were not dramatic fights, but small inconsistencies, silences that lingered too long, details that never quite aligned. He told himself these were the normal adjustments of a new marriage, the awkwardness of two lives learning to coexist. But the doubts did not fade. They multiplied. And when the truth surfaced, through conversations he did not want to have, through confirmations he did not want to seek, it shattered not only his trust in his partner, but his understanding of his own role as a husband and a father. In breaking his silence, Tygo framed the alleged betrayal not as a single act, but as a sustained deception. He spoke of love offered in good faith, of responsibility embraced without hesitation, and of a future imagined with absolute sincerity. The most painful part, he suggested, was not the end of the marriage itself, but the realization that the emotional labor he poured into the family was built on a foundation he never consented to. Every bedtime story, every protective instinct, every sacrifice suddenly felt suspended in a moral void, real in emotion, yet questioned in origin. He did not describe rage. Instead, he described exhaustion, the kind that settles in when certainty dissolves and memory turns against you. He recalled moments he once treasured, family dinners, shared routines, private jokes, and how they now replayed with an altered meaning. In his words, the marriage lasted only a year on paper, but the psychological impact stretched far beyond its official timeline. The collapse came not with a public scandal, but with an internal reckoning that forced him to confront how easily love can be weaponized through silence. When Tygo explained his decision to leave, he framed it as an act of survival rather than abandonment. Staying, he implied, would have meant continuing a performance in a story whose core truth had been withheld from him. He spoke carefully, avoiding theatrical blame, focusing instead on the irreversible fracture of trust. A relationship, he suggested, can sometimes endure infidelity, sometimes endure disappointment, but rarely can it survive a reality so fundamentally misrepresented from the start. As his voice steadied, another layer emerged, grief not only for the marriage, but for the version of himself that believed without question. He acknowledged the paradox that love can be genuine even when its circumstances are not, and that caring for children does not evaporate simply because biology intervenes. Yet he also admitted that such contradictions carry a cost, one that eventually demands a decision. To remain would be to deny his own boundaries. To leave would be to accept a loneliness shaped by truth rather than illusion. Tygo's account did not seek absolution, nor did it offer closure. Instead, it unfolded like a slow unveiling of wounds long hidden behind professional composure and public restraint. Each sentence carried the weight of restraint finally released, as if silence itself had become unbearable. What lingered most was not the allegation of betrayal, but the quiet devastation of a man confronting the possibility that the life he defended so fiercely was never entirely his to defend at all, and the uneasy awareness that some truths, once spoken, continue to echo long after the voice falls silent. He described the days after the truth emerged not as dramatic confrontations, but as a strange suspension of time. Mornings still arrived, coffee still cooled in the mug before he remembered to drink it. The children still asked ordinary questions. What was for dinner? Whether he would be home early? If he could help with homework? Tygo Gernandt noticed how his hands continued to perform familiar gestures almost automatically. Tying shoelaces, placing a reassuring palm on a small shoulder, nodding while listening. Yet inside, every gesture felt newly fragile, as if the meaning behind it had shifted, while the motion remained the same. Tygo Gernandt admitted that the most unsettling part was how convincing the illusion had been. There were no obvious villains in the daily routine, no loud alarms warning him that his reality was quietly being rewritten. He remembered standing in doorways, watching the children sleep, counting their breaths the way parents do without realizing it. In those moments, doubt did not feel logical. It felt intrusive, almost cruel. He pushed it away repeatedly, telling himself that love was proven through presence, not genetics. And yet, once the truth entered the room, it refused to leave, hovering over every memory like a shadow cast backward in time. He spoke of small details that now returned to him with unsettling clarity. A remark made too casually. A story about the past that never quite aligned with another version. Paperwork he never fully examined because trust made scrutiny feel unnecessary. At the time, these details were nothing. In retrospect, they formed a quiet pattern, one that only became visible once it was too late to unsee it. Tygo explained that betrayal, when prolonged, does not arrive as a single blow. It arrives as a slow erosion, hollowing out certainty while leaving the surface intact. In recounting his marriage to Diane van den Eng, he avoided grand accusations. Instead, he lingered on atmosphere. On the way, conversations ended too quickly. On the silence that followed questions that should have been answered easily. On the peculiar loneliness of sharing a home while sensing that part of the truth lived elsewhere. He said there were evenings when he sat across from her, listening to the rhythm of her voice, feeling both close and inexplicably distant. Unable, then, to articulate why. The revelation about the children, he emphasized, did not erase the bond he felt with them. If anything, it complicated it beyond language. He described how love does not simply obey facts, it resists them. Even after the truth was confirmed, his instinct was still to protect, to worry, to care. Yet layered beneath that instinct was a new, painful awareness. That his devotion had been built on an assumption he was never given the chance to question. That awareness, he said, carried a unique kind of grief, one that had no clear outlet, no socially acceptable script. As days turned into nights of restless sleep, Tygo found himself replaying moments that once felt insignificant. A birthday celebration that now felt staged. A family photograph that suddenly seemed to contain too many unspoken truths. He wondered how many versions of the same memory could exist at once, the one he lived in sincerely, and the one that had always contained a hidden absence. This duality, he confessed, was what eventually exhausted him more than anger ever could. The decision to leave did not arrive with clarity or confidence. It came gradually, through the recognition that staying required him to constantly negotiate with a reality that no longer felt stable. He spoke of the psychological toll of pretending that nothing fundamental had changed, of smiling in public while privately unraveling the meaning of words like husband and father. He described moments when he caught his own reflection and barely recognized the man staring back. Someone older, quieter, carrying a weight he could not set down. Tygo also reflected on masculinity and expectation, on how men are often taught to endure silently, to absorb pain without articulation. Breaking that silence, he said, felt both necessary and deeply uncomfortable. Not because he feared judgment, but because speaking required him to admit how deeply he had been hurt. Vulnerability, in this context, was not a performance. It was an exposure of wounds he had tried to manage privately for far too long. Throughout his account, there was a persistent sense of disorientation. He described it as living in a familiar house after the furniture has been subtly rearranged in the dark. You know the space, yet you keep bumping into edges that were never there before. Trust, once fractured, does not simply disappear. It turns into constant vigilance, a background noise that never fully fades. As he continued to speak, Tygo did not offer lessons or warnings. He simply allowed the story to unfold through texture. The weight of keys in his pocket when he finally left the house for the last time. The silence of a car ride taken without destination. The strange calm that sometimes followed overwhelming pain. These moments, he suggested, were where the truth actually lived. Not in headlines or accusations, but in the quiet aftermath where a person must learn how to stand again in a life that no longer resembles the one they thought they were protecting. And as his voice trailed into reflection rather than resolution, it became clear that what he was revealing was not just the end of a marriage, but the ongoing process of redefining himself in the absence of certainty, carrying love, loss, and unanswered questions side by side, without knowing which of them would demand the highest price in the days still unfolding. In the weeks that followed his departure, time no longer behaved in a linear way for Tygo Gernandt. Some days collapsed into a blur of routine, while others stretched endlessly, heavy with thoughts he could not complete. He spoke of waking up in unfamiliar silence, the kind that does not announce itself loudly, but settles into the corners of a room. There were mornings when he instinctively reached for his phone, only to stop midway, unsure of whom he would even call. The absence was not dramatic. It was precise, almost surgical, cutting away the structure of a life while leaving its outline intact. What unsettled him most was how little of the truth had actually been spoken out loud. There were no final conversations that tied loose ends together, no definitive explanations that made the past suddenly coherent. Instead, fragments remained, half-finished sentences, looks that suggested more than they revealed, questions that lingered just long enough to be felt, but never answered. He hinted that even now, certain details remained deliberately untouched, not because they were unimportant, but because confronting them too directly might collapse something he was still trying to hold upright. He described moments when memory betrayed him. Scenes he once trusted resurfaced with altered emphasis. A pause in a conversation that now felt intentional. A smile that seemed rehearsed rather than spontaneous. These recollections did not arrive as accusations. They arrived as puzzles. And the more he tried to assemble them, the more he sensed that some pieces were missing by design. The past, he suggested, is not always rewritten by lies. Sometimes it is edited through omission. When he spoke of Diane van den Eng, his tone shifted subtly. Not harsher, not softer, just more guarded. He did not attempt to define her role in clear terms, as if resisting the temptation to simplify something that was, by nature, layered. He implied that there were truths she carried that he would never fully access, and that perhaps this distance had existed long before the marriage officially ended. The idea troubled him, that intimacy can coexist with secrecy, that proximity does not guarantee transparency. There were nights, he admitted, when he replayed hypothetical conversations in his head, questions he might have asked earlier, answers he might have recognized if he had been listening differently. Yet each imagined scenario ended the same way, with uncertainty. He realized that even if every fact were placed neatly in front of him, the emotional truth might still remain unresolved. Some wounds, he suggested, do not heal through information alone. The children remained a presence in his thoughts, though he spoke of them indirectly, almost cautiously. He avoided naming specific moments, as if doing so would anchor them too firmly in a narrative that was still shifting. What he allowed to surface instead was a feeling, an unresolved tension between attachment and distance. He acknowledged that love does not evaporate simply because circumstances change, but he also hinted at the quiet fear of loving something that now existed in an undefined space, neither fully claimed nor fully released. As his story continued, a pattern emerged. Every attempt at clarity seemed to open another layer of ambiguity. Legal processes moved forward, conversations occurred behind closed doors, decisions were made, but none of them delivered the emotional resolution people often expect. He spoke of signing documents that felt strangely abstract, of official language that failed to capture the complexity of what had been lost. Closure, he implied, is often a word used by outsiders, not by those living inside the aftermath. Tygo also reflected on how public perception distorts private reality. Once his silence broke, interpretations multiplied, some sympathetic, others reductive. He did not correct them. He seemed almost resigned to the idea that his story would exist in multiple versions simultaneously, none of them entirely accurate, none entirely false. Mystery, in that sense, was not something he manufactured. It was something that naturally formed when truth encountered limited understanding. At times, he described a strange calm, moments when the uncertainty itself felt lighter than the false certainty that preceded it. Yet even these moments were fleeting, quickly replaced by questions that refused to settle. What does responsibility mean when its foundation is questioned? Where does one place loyalty when its original context no longer exists? He did not attempt to answer these questions, only to acknowledge their persistence. As he spoke, it became clear that the story he was telling was not moving toward resolution, but toward coexistence with the unknown. Facts had surfaced, yes, but meaning lagged behind. And perhaps, he suggested, without stating it directly, meaning always does. The silence he broke did not give way to clarity. It gave way to a deeper, more intricate quiet, one filled with unresolved echoes, suspended emotions, and the unsettling realization that some truths do not conclude a story, but simply ensure it continues to unfold, quietly, long after the words stop. As the months slipped by, Tygo Gernandt found himself inhabiting a life that felt both lighter and heavier at the same time. Lighter because the performance had ended, no more pretending that everything was intact. Heavier because nothing had replaced what was lost. He spoke of days when he moved through the city almost invisibly, surrounded by people yet fundamentally alone, as if the world had continued at its usual pace, while his own internal rhythm had slowed to something unfamiliar. There were moments when he caught himself almost believing that the past could be restored through routine. He would take the same routes, visit the same cafes, sit at the same tables. Muscle memory, he realized, is persuasive. It suggests continuity, even when meaning has fractured. But then something small would interrupt the illusion. A laugh overheard, a child's voice, a question asked without intention, and the fragile balance would tilt again. These interruptions were not dramatic. They were precise. They reminded him that time moves forward without consulting those still negotiating with yesterday. When thoughts of Diane Van den Eng surfaced, they arrived without a clear emotional label. Not anger, not longing, something quieter, harder to define. He described it as a muted echo, like hearing a familiar song from another room. Close enough to recognize, too distant to engage with fully. He resisted the urge to assign blame neatly, perhaps because doing so would simplify a story that no longer felt simple. Or perhaps because certainty, once lost, does not return easily. At night, he sometimes lay awake, replaying not arguments, but neutral moments. Silence at the dinner table. The way certain questions were redirected rather than answered. He wondered whether the signs had always been there, patiently waiting for him to notice, or whether hindsight was constructing meaning where none originally existed. This uncertainty troubled him more than any confirmed betrayal. It suggested that understanding is often shaped less by facts than by timing. And that clarity arrives only when its consequences can no longer be avoided. He spoke briefly about the future, but only in abstract terms. Plans felt provisional now, subject to revision. He had learned, perhaps too late, how fragile assumptions can be. Words like forever and family no longer felt stable enough to rest weight upon. Yet he did not reject them outright. He simply held them differently, as one might hold something cracked but not entirely broken. Carefully, without expecting it to function as it once did. There were days when he felt an unexpected sense of calm. Moments when the unanswered questions receded just enough to let him breathe. In those moments, ambiguity felt almost protective, a buffer against the sharp edges of reality. But the calm never lasted. It was always followed by a return of doubt, subtle but persistent, like a tide that cannot be permanently held back. He learned to live within that fluctuation, neither resisting it nor fully surrendering to it. What lingered most was not the betrayal itself, but the way it altered his perception of intimacy. Trust, he realized, is not a single decision, but a series of quiet permissions given over time. Once revoked, even partially, it leaves behind a space that cannot easily be refilled. He questioned whether that space would remain empty, or whether something else, something unnamed, might eventually grow there. As he continued to move forward, Tygo did not claim healing, nor did he describe closure. Instead, he spoke of adjustment, of learning how to exist without demanding immediate answers, of accepting that some stories do not resolve themselves neatly, and that some relationships continue to shape us even after they have ended. His words suggested that life, in the aftermath of truth, becomes less about resolution and more about endurance. And so his silence, once broken, did not lead to a final declaration or a definitive ending. It opened a door onto a quieter, more uncertain landscape, one where questions coexist with daily life, where meaning is negotiated rather than discovered, and where the absence of certainty becomes its own form of presence. In that space, he continues on, not entirely free of the past, not entirely bound to it either, leaving those who listen to wonder where truth truly ends, and where the story, perhaps, still quietly goes on.